Well, good morning. I have to tell you that it's good to be back. I haven't aged a bit since I left, and that's because it was so cold I was preserved. But I'm happy to be here. I'd like for you to open your New Testaments to, I'm probably pushing it the wrong direction. It is on. I'm not getting a second. You can still turn there without reading it to John, the 20th chapter. We're going to be looking at verses 30 and 31 in just a moment. Thank you all, visitors, for being with us this morning. And we recently, we've had as a kind of a schedule that I've been presenting lessons on the life of Jesus as it's recorded in the Gospel of Mark. And we just finished that in December. And so today I want to begin, I can just do it here if you need.
Just do it there.
Yeah. And I hate to have to do it analog, touching buttons. We'd like to do the same thing with the life of Jesus as it's recorded for us in the Gospel of John. I've been saying for years now, if we're going to be disciples of Jesus Christ, we need to know about Jesus. We need to know who he is and everything that we can about him so that we can become like him. And so I'm just curious, this is just a question, and you'll understand why in a second. How many of you were members here in 2009? Just raise your hand. So there's a few of you that were here. This is an introductory lesson to the Gospel of John. And I want to tackle again, as I did in 2009, the topic of who wrote the Gospel of John. And you're probably saying, well, this is going to take 2 seconds. Because if I look at John and I open up to the Gospel, it says the Gospel of John. And it's called the Gospel of John. So Dan, you have this is a really easy lesson. I don't believe that the Apostle John wrote this book. And I'll give you my reasons for doubting that tradition, as well as talking about why I think that the person that wrote it did write it. When I presented this material in 2009, and I was talking to Tim about that this morning. It seems like it's about 4 or 5 years ago when I did this, and it's been 15. So that's how time goes. I'm only going to do this in one lesson, so we're going to compact things. Let me add here that what I'm about to say has nothing to do with the integrity of this book. Has nothing to do with casting a shadow on the content or its place in the canon. I believe this book is inspired, and I believe that it's a legitimate part of the canon, and that the writer had a specific purpose in writing it, and that's in our text this morning in John chapter 20 and verses 30 and 31, where it says, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe, and that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So what we're investigating in this lesson is the tradition that surrounds the book that says that the Apostle John wrote it. And I wanted to do this at the beginning of the series so that as I'm going through the whole series of lessons, I often will say the writer of the Gospel of John, or the author of the Gospel of John. And now you'll know why I say I do the same thing with the book of Hebrews, the writer of the book of Hebrews, because we don't know for sure who wrote that. I'm not going to make a big deal of this in the future. I'm not going to be pounding on it all the way through in this series. We're going to look at a lot of passages this morning. Some of them I'm going to put up there numerous times, and so I'm not going to read them all again, but you'll see the passage so you'll know the part that I'm talking about. So let's begin with the basics of the gospel. And the first thing is that the Gospel of John is not a synoptic gospel. I don't know if you've heard that term before or not. A synoptic gospel, a synoptic gospel, or a synopsis is a general overview of some topic. And the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all fall into that category. Matthew and Luke begin the life of Jesus with his birth. Mark begins with the baptism of Jesus, and then they just kind of go in a chronological way through the life of Christ from start to finish. The Gospel of John only covers just a few weeks in the life of Jesus. In fact, from chapter 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 all happened in one night. So you can see that he's covering particular points for his purpose, which is to bring someone to faith that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, as we just read in that text. The main characteristics of this book is, first of all, that the miracles that the writer adds here are chosen to fulfill his purpose, to show that Jesus is the Messiah. And there are some miracles that he's going to present to us that are unique. They're unique to this gospel. Another characteristic is, because we don't know who the author is, we don't know when it was written. Probably from the text, it would seem that it was written before the temple was destroyed. It seems that it was written before Peter died, because that's going to be the topic in the last chapter. I'm guessing, but I think it was probably written before 70 AD, not in the 90s as some assert. Tradition says, as I've already pointed out, that the author is John, the apostle, the brother of James, a son of Zebedee. He is the author of 3 epistles, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and he's also the author of the book of Revelation, and we clearly see that from at least 2 of those epistles. Whoever it was, let me put this up there. I don't know if I have anything else. I have passages now. Whoever it was, I know was an eyewitness of the events of Jesus' life. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. He said, we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. So he was around Jesus and saw Jesus and knew him. We also know from the text in chapter 18 and verse 15, Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus in the high priest's courtyard. So whoever is the author also knew and was known by the high priest. We also know that he knew more than he wrote down. He says in the last chapter, this is a disciple who testifies to these things, who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. And that's obviously hyperbole, but he's saying there's a lot more. I had a lot more material that I could have added, but I didn't. He also says here that his testimony is true, so we know that. And for whatever reason, this author wanted to remain anonymous, but he does give us hints as to his identity. Here in chapter 21 and verse 20, Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved was following him. This was the one who leaned back against Jesus at the supper and said, Lord, who is going to betray you? Then in verse 24, this is the disciple who testifies about these things. So whatever that disciple was that was leaning back next to Jesus at the Last Supper, in the last Passover there that they had together, is the one who's doing this. He is the disciple that Jesus loved. And if we add one more here, there's a lot more I could say about that, but I'm trying to be brief. And I know that you're shocked at that. So why I don't think it's John. And let me just tell you at the beginning of this that my inquiry into the authorship originally was based on things that didn't seem to fit to me and didn't seem to fit with John the Apostle. Again, let me reiterate, what I'm about to say here has nothing to do with the book and the integrity of the book and the truthfulness of the book. I'm talking about the author. And when we get into the study, we won't be talking about the author, we'll be talking about Jesus. But I want us to understand that there's questions here. So first of all, and this is pretty obvious, the author's self-description here is that he is the disciple that Jesus loved. And we just read that in the text in John 21, 20 and verse 24, Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following him. what that's saying is, this is a claim that Jesus loved, whoever this author is, loved him in a way that he didn't love the other disciples. It's not saying he didn't love the other disciples, but this was a particular love that he had for this one disciple. He is the disciple Jesus loved. And that's his claim. And obviously I think is truthful. And it's not talking about his love for the Lord or the other disciples' love for the Lord. This is a love that Jesus had for him. And I don't believe that it's bragging here. I think he's just saying everybody will recognize who the author is from that statement. And he uses it a number of times. In John chapter 13 and verse 23, one of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. So this is at the banquet that was thrown in honor of Jesus for raising Lazarus in John 13. In John 18, Simon, Peter, and another disciple were following Jesus because the disciple was known to the high priest. He went with Jesus into the high priest courtyard, but Peter had to wait outside. And again, this is the other disciple that we've talked about, and he mentions himself there that he was known by the high priest. In John 19, 26 and 27, when Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, "Woman, here is your son," and to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from this time on, the disciple took her to be in his home. And then later in John 20, verses 2 through 8, Mary Magdalene has come back from the tomb. She's seen Jesus, and she said, he's risen. And so she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've put him." So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. And then in chapter 20 and verse 2 through 8, he bent over and looked in the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went inside. He saw and believed. And then in chapter 21 and verse 7, again, the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard this, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his garment and then jumped into the water. So, and we've already seen chapter 21, verse 20 and 24. I've already read it to you twice. I'm not going to put that up there again. So, one of the things that I noticed is that people say, well, John is the author, and the reason he doesn't name himself is because of his humility. And so he calls himself the disciple that Jesus loved instead of using his name. That always kind of struck me, because saying you are the disciple that Jesus loved seems a little less than humble. And so there has to be more to it. John is mentioned in all of the other Gospels. And there's no attempt to hide him in those Gospels. But when you go to Luke chapter 24, and this is kind of interesting, in Luke chapter 24 and verse 12, when we have this same visit to the tomb, Luke records, Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves, and he went away wondering to himself what happened. It makes me wonder, well, why, if it's John, why didn't Luke include him? Why didn't he say John was with Peter when they ran to the tomb? Why not add that? And so that has led me to believe, again, that this is a different person other than John the Apostle. And I know that John was a part of the inner circle of Jesus, Peter, Andrew, James. And sometimes Andrew is included in that on one occasion. But this disciple here, the author calls himself the other disciple. And he never refers to himself as an apostle. So there's more going on here. I think that there were more than just Jesus and the 12 apostles at the Last Supper. If you look at John chapter 21 in the parenthetical statement, when Peter saw this disciple Jesus loved, said he was the one that leaned back against Jesus at the supper. And so he's obviously there. And in chapter 18, see, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. 13 13, back to the actual historic event, 13:21 through 24, after he had said this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and testified, "Very truly I tell you, one of you is going to betray me." His disciples stared at one another at a loss to know which of them he meant. One of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him, and Simon Peter motioned to this disciple and said, "Ask him which one he means." So when you have a discussion in the Gospels about the 12, that's just another name for the apostles. And they're the name for the apostles whether they're all there or not. If you compare Mark 14, where it says, when evening came, Jesus arrived with the 12 to this upper room where he's going to have the Passover, and you compare that to Luke 22:8, that Jesus had already sent Peter and John saying, "Go make preparations for us to eat the Passover," that when it says Jesus arrived with the 12, he's actually saying he arrived with 10, because there's 2 already there. So I want you to notice now Jesus' statement here in Mark 14 and verse 20. When they asked him, "Who's going to betray you?" Jesus said, "It's one of the 12, one who dips bread into the bowl with me." If there's only 12 apostles there with Jesus, when he says it's one of the 12, that doesn't make sense. He could have just said it's one of you. So the fact that Jesus said it's one of the 12 indicates that there's more than just 12 people there. More than the 12 apostles that are there. And that his betrayer, though, is not going to just come out of the general body of disciples, however many of them there were, but it's going to be one of his apostles. When I add what we read in Acts, the first chapter, when Judas' place is being taken, or the choice is being made as to who's going to take Judas' place, in verse 21 and 22 of Acts 1, "Therefore it is necessary to choose one of the men who have been with us the whole time the Lord Jesus was living among us, beginning with John's baptism to the time when Jesus was taken up from us. For one of these must become a witness with us of his resurrection." I would imagine that they too at least had to be here at this Passover. Think of all of the teaching that Jesus did in chapters 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17 that they would have missed out on if they hadn't been there. And the foot washing and all of that, and the lesson that was being taught. So the institutional Lord's Supper, I mean, there's just so much going on in that upper room that there had to be more, in my opinion, there had to be more than just the 12 apostles and Jesus. Then we come to the one that just really struck me the most, and that's in John the 18th chapter, and this connection with the high priest. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus because this disciple was known to the high priest. And so people are saying, well, then that's John. Peter couldn't get in because he wasn't known to the high priest, but the author of the book could get in because he was known to the high priest. Let me take you to one other passage and we'll make some comments. Here is Acts chapter 4. I'm not going to read, obviously, verses 1 through 23. This is, I don't know why I have an extra dash on there. This is when Peter and John are in trial before the Sanhedrin. Annas and Caiaphas are both there. And we note especially here, verse 13, when the Sanhedrin and these high priests, when they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized that they were unschooled, ordinary men, they were astonished, and they took note that these men had been with Jesus. John apparently is not known to the high priest. What he recognizes in him is that he's been with Jesus, not that, "Oh, hi, John. Long time no see. And remember me," and we had this relationship. And it's because of that got me to thinking it can't be the Apostle John. Why would a fisherman from Galilee know the high priest? Why would he have a personal relationship with him that he can come and go into his house? So all of these things have kind of pointed me to the fact that it can't be the Apostle John. That's, again, my opinion. Now I know you're all on the edge of your seat, so who do I think wrote the gospel? Well, going back again, I know that he was a disciple Jesus loved. He was the disciple that Jesus loved. I should have changed the to the. We've already seen 6 different passages where that phrase is used, that the author uses to describe himself. And as I look in the scriptures, I can see 4 people that are identified as being people that it says specifically that Jesus loved. The first one, and you don't have to turn there if you don't want. I'm not going to. But Mark 10, we have the rich young ruler. And it says Jesus loved him. But he can't be the author of this book because he's not a disciple. He walked away from the Lord. So he doesn't fall into the category of fulfilling the conditions of being a disciple. The second group of people is Lazarus and his sisters. All of them. In John 11, verse 3, so the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. We look at verse 5. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So now we have a statement that Jesus loved the whole family. Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. But then we add in verse 36, the crowd, as they're seeing Jesus and his reaction, and they say, see how he loved him. See how he loved him. Again, it can't be the Mary and Martha. I know that because in John 19:26, when Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing by, he said, woman, here's your son. So it has to be a male. And so that kind of narrows it down from the clues from the book, from the New Testament, that the one that he loved would be Lazarus. That doesn't mean that he's the author. It just tells me that he's the one that Jesus loved, and it provides me a foundation. Another interesting facet is that Lazarus isn't mentioned in any other Gospels. He's not mentioned in Matthew or Mark or Luke. And Lazarus is just in this Gospel suddenly appears in John the 11th chapter in the event of his resurrection. And Jesus coming back and raising him from the dead after he'd been dead for 4 days. And unless that created quite a furor in Jerusalem. In fact, in chapter 12 and verse 9, it said, meanwhile, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there and came, not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So, and because of that, in fact, let me go another step further. In John 12, 10, 11, so the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well. For on account of him, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and believing on him. So now we come, and I want us to go to the triumphal entry. I just want you to picture that in your mind. We've talked about that a number of times. And you see all of these people coming outside of the city of Jerusalem to meet Jesus. Why? Why is there such a big crowd there? Well, the reason for that is found in John chapter 12, verses 17 through 19. Now the crowd that was with him when he called Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to spread the word. Many people, because they had heard that he had performed the sign, went out to meet him. So the Pharisees said to one another, see, this is getting us nowhere. Look how the whole world has gone after him. The reason why there's such a huge crowd at the triumphal entry is because Jesus had raised Lazarus from the dead. And the word had spread. And all of these visitors and pilgrims from other places who weren't there then are going out to see Jesus. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not mention Lazarus or the reason for the crowds. That seems odd to me. The other thing now that happens is suddenly Lazarus disappears from the record in what we call the Gospel of John. From chapter 11 and chapter 12, we have 11 times that he's named, that his name is identified. He's identified by Lazarus. Chapter 13, he's gone. He's no longer, Lazarus suddenly disappears from the record. But the other interesting thing is that the disciple that Jesus loved suddenly appears. It had never been referred to in that way before until chapter 13. It's getting more interesting. What would you expect would be the reaction or the actions of a person who Jesus had raised from the dead? I will tell you, one of the things that I would expect is that they would never want to be apart from Jesus. They're going to be by him, and they're going to be by him regardless of the consequences. There's nothing that's going to prevent them from staying with Jesus. The last time that we see Lazarus acting, he's going to be named later in chapter 12, but the last time we see him doing something and identified is in John chapter 12 and verse 2. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. The first time we see the disciple that Jesus loved is in chapter 13 and verse 23. It's the first time he's mentioned. And it says that one of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. And this is at the Last Supper, the Passover. The next time we see the disciple that Jesus loved are situations that are less than safe. In John 18, 15 through 16, I'm not going to read that all again, but it's right in the courtyard of the high priest where Jesus has just been arrested and is being tried. He is there, and he's known to the high priest. He knows he's known to the high priest. Still goes in. He's not going to be kept away from Jesus. And then the next time is John 19, verse 26, at the foot of the cross, when Jesus gives the care of his mother to this disciple. There are no apostles here. They're all hiding. Or like Peter is still out probably bitterly weeping over his denial. But this disciple's here, and he's at the foot of the cross where everybody can see him, and he's there with Jesus' mother. There's nothing that's going to keep this person from being near Jesus, regardless of the consequences to him. So now let's look at some other events and see if Lazarus fits the description of this other disciple, the disciple that Jesus loved. And the first one is the care of Mary. And again, I've already read this passage. It's up there for you to see. What is Jesus going to do with his apostles in about 50 days? Well, actually not 50 days, 10 days. He's going to give them a great commission. He's going to tell them to do what? To go and to go into all the world, to go make disciples of all nations. Lazarus isn't going to be sent as an apostle to go into all the nations. He's going to be right there with Jesus' mother. Plus, Lazarus has two sisters at home who can help him take care of her. And so Lazarus just seems to be a better candidate for a substitutionary son than John would have been. So let's go now to the empty tomb that we've talked about. And this is in John 20, verses 1 through 10. I'm not going to read that whole text. But here is verses 2 through 4. We just read a minute ago. It says that Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. And I just, as we stop there, I just want you to think, why did he get there first? I used to have a different opinion than I have now. And the opinion that I always had was because John was younger. And so he was more fleet of foot than Peter was. But that's not my opinion anymore. I'll tell you that in a minute. So when they get there, and the disciple that Jesus loved, who we just said earlier was one of these, he bent over and looked at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him, and going where angels fear to tread, Peter just burst right into the tomb. Peter saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around his head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Now, I just need to describe this for you, because if somebody's trying to get out of these grave clothes and they're just strewing them everywhere and tearing them off, there's not any purpose for saying that the headband or napkin is separate. Just go into your teenager's bedroom and you'll see that things aren't just, when they're everywhere, you don't say, oh, that's over there by itself. No, everything's over there by itself. So what you see here is the linen clothes lying. They're flat where the body was, and up here where the head was is that napkin that was folded. So that's what they see. And finally, the other disciple, which would be the disciple that Jesus loved, the one who reached the tomb first, he also went inside, and what does it say? It said he saw and believed. So, that disciple cannot be John. And the reason that disciple cannot be John is because in Mark chapter 16 and verse 10 and 11, when Mary Magdalene comes and tells them that Jesus was alive, they, the apostles, did not believe it. Afterward, Jesus appeared in a different form to two of them. That's in Luke, the guys on the road to Emmaus. These returned and reported to the rest, but they did not believe them either. None of the apostles have believed that Jesus has been raised from the dead. Verse 14, Jesus later appeared to the 11 as they were eating. He rebuked them for what? For their lack of faith and their stubborn refusal to believe those who had seen him that he had risen. Listen, none of the apostles believed that Jesus had been raised from the dead before he's standing right in front of them. Yeah. Look at Peter. Let me read this. When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to 11, to all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others who were with them that told this to the apostles, but they did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. All right, this now is Peter's reaction. Again, Luke does not record that the other disciple was with him, but here's what he does tell us about Peter. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves, and he went away. He went away wondering what had happened. We would say he left bewildered. But this disciple that we just read saw and believed. So I want you just to think about what we just read. Here's a person who, and again, let's just say it's Lazarus here, because I believe it is. His passionate love for the Lord, for what the Lord had done for him in raising him from the dead, and has just energized him. It gives him speed, stamina, whatever it is. He wants him to be alive. But his previous experience with death, his previous experience with being in a tomb, made him reluctant to go in again. And so he just stands outside and looks and sees the linen cloths lying there. Seeing the linen cloths would have reminded him of his own grave clothes. When he was raised from the dead in chapter 11, the dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and cloth around his face. Jesus said, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." He couldn't get out of them himself. He needed help to get rid of those. He's reminded of that. But what he saw when he looked inside of the grave clothes just flat. And the napkin up here. And when he saw that, he believed. He knew that was a miraculous thing. That Jesus had been raised from the dead. One other thing. Let's go to the shore on the Sea of Galilee. The miracle of the catch of fish. In John 21, verses 2 and 3, Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, who's that? James and John, and two other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them, and they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out, fished all night, didn't catch anything. I kind of passed over that real quickly. We are told who's here. We're told Peter and Thomas and Nathanael are there, and the sons of Zebedee, which are James and John, and two other unnamed disciples. And Peter says he's going fishing, and all of them want to go. Now, I know three of them are fishermen. Peter and James and John are fishermen. I don't know about Thomas and Nathaniel, and I don't know about these two other disciples. But listen, if I was there and they said they're going fishing, I'm going too.
Amen.
I'm just going to be out there on the boat and watch what's happening. So then we get to John 21, 4 through 6. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, have you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat and you'll find some." Now, again, remember, they fished all night. Just like, doesn't this call to your mind the calling of them at the very beginning of the Gospels? When they did, they were unable to haul the fish in because of the large number of fish that they caught. They can't bring it in. Too many. Now, verse 7. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved, so I know he's there, and I know he must be one of those two disciples that aren't named. There's two other disciples. He said to Peter, "It's the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It's the Lord," he did what he did there. So the disciple that Jesus loved recognizes that it is Jesus. So that tells me he's there. And if you want to read further, an interesting thing, verse 8, when they come to shore, Jesus already got a fire going and fish cooking. That's an interesting thing. So that's just a little side note. So now let's look at this first extended conversation that Jesus has with Peter about his denial. And this is in chapter 21, verses 15 through 23. Again, I'm not going to read the whole text, but we'll look at a little bit of it. In chapter 21, verses 15 through 17, Jesus said, "Do you love me? Yes, I love you. Feed my sheep, feed my lambs." The whole 3 times he has to say he loves him, probably with reference or corresponding to the 3 denials that he had. But in verses 18 and 19, Jesus, speaking to Peter, has taken him aside, I think, to do all of this "do you love me" stuff. "Very truly I tell you," Jesus said to Peter, "when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." And so Jesus has giving Peter information about the fact that he's going to die, and that he's going to die a martyr's death. He's going to be taken where he doesn't want to go. But again, it's not going to happen until he's old, which comes into play in the book of Acts. We've talked about that before. So at this point, our hero shows up, the disciple that Jesus loved. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved was following him. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and said, "Lord," who is going to betray you. When Peter saw him, he asked, "Lord, what about him?" What about him? How's he going to die? What's going to happen to him? I know now what's going to happen to me. How about him? And Jesus responded, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me." So that's the response. Now is added, because of this, the rumor spread among the believers that this disciple would not die. But Jesus did not say that he would not die. He only said, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you?" So a rumor was started based on the fact that Jesus said, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what's that to you?" Who heard that? Only Peter, who started the rumor. Peter did. Peter's the one that started that rumor. The author is, however, the disciple that Jesus loved. And he's going to explain to us what Jesus said and didn't say. He didn't say he would not die. That's only a hypothetical that if he wanted him to live, that's his business. Your business is to follow me, Peter. So here is my point. And my point is that rumors have generally some sliver, some basis in truth, especially if it's a rumor that's started by an apostle like Peter. So what is there about this disciple that Jesus loved that would fuel that kind of a rumor? What's the foundation that people would say, that may be the case because of who it was spoken about? If it's Lazarus, Lazarus has already died, and he's been raised from the dead. And there are a couple of other people in the New Testament that Jesus raised from the dead. All of them were young. Chances are they are still alive. And so it would be very easy for them to say, well, if this is the disciple Jesus loved, had a love for him like he had for no other disciples, maybe he's not going to die, ever. Which the author corrects right here. That rumor is not true. He didn't say that. All of that points to Lazarus as the author of this gospel. So real quickly, why would Lazarus not use his own name? Well, the purpose of his writing, as we've already seen, is to focus on Jesus, to create faith in him, that he's the Messiah, the Son of God. All the focus needs to be on him. Lazarus, in the meantime, has been made an unwilling celebrity by no choice of his own. He was raised from the dead, and consequently large crowds are coming to see Lazarus, who has been raised from the dead. And in chapter 12, verses 17 through 19, the Pharisees are saying, it's getting us nowhere. Look how the whole world has gone after him. Why? Because of Lazarus. Lazarus would see himself as a distraction. Who's he wanting to have all the glory? Who is he wanting the focus to be placed on? And so from that time on in chapter 12, Lazarus disappears from the text. And the person now is identified as a disciple that Jesus loved. Now, even the disciples, the apostles, were distracted by that. Look at what Peter said. What about him? What about this guy you love that you raised from the dead? I think that the reason that people say John didn't put his name in there because of humility fits Lazarus a lot better, because the purpose that he had for writing the gospel is to create faith in Jesus, and he would have every reason to want all of the glory and all of the honor to go to the Lord, who loved him so much that he raised him from the dead. Yes, I've made a few assumptions as we've gone through this in identifying Lazarus as the author of the book of John. None of them require great leaps of faith, I hope. And none of them are based on traditions and opinions of men from the standpoint of this is what somebody said that this is the writer. Everything I've shown you today came right out of this book. Based on what's contained in this gospel. So, you get to decide. And listen, it's not going to matter if you agree with me or disagree. It's certainly not a matter of faith. Again, we're not talking about the Gospel of John, we're talking about the author. But I do hope that you've been changed by this study, not at all meaning your opinion about who wrote the book, but that perhaps not everything has been found. Not everything has been discovered. And some of the things that we have assumed to be true, based on opinions and having been told that over and over again, or having it printed at the beginning of your Bible, that's the Gospel of John, may not be correct. It certainly gives us pause. And hopefully it will encourage you to reconsider God's word in light of what he has revealed rather than what other people have said about it. I will tell you that there seems to me, and this is again probably a prejudiced view, but there seems to me that this book takes on a new depth if I view it as having come from the pen of Lazarus. It puts a different color to some of the things that were written. I thought about this. Lazarus didn't get to go into all the world and preach the gospel because he wasn't an apostle. But his account of the life of Christ did. You have it in your lap. He was able to do the same thing by writing this down, and it went out anonymously. Because again, it was to the glory of God. But it was an eyewitness account. It's a book that claims accuracy. All of the miracles and signs that he's recorded here are true. It's truly good news, both with regard to who Jesus is and with regard to our salvation that comes through him. And it's a book that starting next month, hopefully the second Sunday of each month, we'll be taking lessons as we go through the book. My last statement is, if you believe that the message of this book is true, that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, if you'll act on that faith, if you'll be born again, as he says in John the 3rd chapter, if you'll give yourself to him, then he can save you and eternal life can be yours. But you have to submit, which is, interestingly enough, the invitation song that Mike has chosen. Trust and obey. So we can help you with that this morning. Please let us while we stand and sing.
When we walk